So there are people who say that every part of the Bible points to Jesus. Even those weird parts about bodily functions, even those disturbing parts where lots of people are slaughtered in war. I don't know. What do you think? Can that really be true? And if so, how does that work, actually? Well, you may not know there are actually some very reasonable answers to those questions, and if you want to catch a glimpse of what that looks like, stick around for our interview today with our guest, Chad Bird. Welcome to Hello Bible, a podcast of the New Hampshire Bible Society. I am Dave Denis, Executive Director of the New Hampshire Bible Society, also pastor of United Baptist Church in Concord, New Hampshire. Now, I have sometimes described myself as a Metabaptist, crypto-Lutheran with Anglican highlights. It's been a while since I've said that a lot, and to be honest, I'm not even sure how I would describe myself today, but that crypto-Lutheran part, it's really important because I've been helped a great deal by some really smart, really great-hearted, Jesus-loving Lutheran preachers along my journey. And they have helped me to understand not just the Bible, but especially the salvation message of the Bible as it exists in Jesus. And it's not always easy. I understand it's not always easy to see that story tucked in there as it is, in the middle of disturbing tales of very bad behavior, and long lists of exceedingly odd laws, and even the harangues of dusty, wild-eyed Hebrew prophets. But the thing about our guest today, Chad Bird, is that, in my estimation, he is uniquely gifted at cutting through the obscuring layers of all that wildness and weirdness that's in the Bible. And he has a way of communicating the essential essence of the good news of Jesus. And that's true even for those parts of the Bible that most people would say are devoid of good news. And it's really all about understanding how it's all connected. So you may consider yourself just Bible curious or perhaps even Bible suspicious. If you're in those categories, I think you'll want to hear this interview. Chad may be able to help you lower your defenses a little bit and take some small steps toward the Bible and understanding it, and especially the message that's in it. Enough of that. Let's go ahead and get to the interview. All right, we are here in our online studio with Chad Bird. Chad is a scholar in residence at 1517. We're going to talk a little more about that later. And one of the things 1517 says is they're a Christian nonprofit that specializes in getting the good news of Jesus Christ to as many people as possible, as many ways as possible. And that's been my observation. They do podcasts, podcasts, articles, classes, books, publications, lectures, and conferences. Did I leave anything out, Chad?
That pretty much sums up.
That pretty much sums it up.
Unless we get creative and come up with something else. Yes.
You guys really do get out there. Tell us a little more about yourself.
Yeah, so I'll start with 1517. I've been working for them full-time for, since late 2019, but I was working with them part-time before then. So I'm a scholar in residence for them. And most of what I do is I produce content that is, as I always say, I teach the gospel with an Old Testament accent. So it doesn't matter what I'm doing, podcast form or writing books or speaking at conferences or whatnot. I take the Old Testament and I use that to connect to the work of Christ and to people's lives today. So they call me Scholar in Residence. That's my title. But I'm basically getting the good news out there like 1517 does in all these sorts of ways, but with that focus on the Old Testament. I'm a husband. I'm a father. I'm a grandfather. I'm a Texan. Been here off and on most of my life, and was raised in the church. Raised as a Southern Baptist. I'm in the Lutheran tradition now, but always been in the church, and because I grew up as a Southern Baptist. The Bible, I'm very appreciative of my upbringing because the Bible was always at the very core of what we did. So, Bible. In fact, I can remember I was very young. I was maybe 5 years old, and I memorized all of Genesis 1. And the preacher at the time,
Lord.
yeah. So I guess even then I had a thing for the Old Testament. So the preacher invited me up to the pulpit, and I can still remember vaguely standing there reciting from memory all of Genesis 1. Now I say that not to talk about any kind of memorization skills I have, but just the fact that the Bible was always held up, and Bible study held up as very important. This isn't bibliolatry. This is simply making sure that we are founded upon the Scriptures and how important the Word of God is. So anyway, that kind of shaped me as a child, and as an adult. Well, I went to university. I studied biblical languages, Greek and Hebrew. Studied some basic theology. Went to seminary. Got my seminary degree. Served as a pastor for a while. Came back to that same seminary to teach. I taught Hebrew and Old Testament. Worked on a graduate degree with Hebrew Union College at that time. And for the last 3 years or so, I've been doing what I'm doing now, working for 1517.
I didn't know about your Baptist background. I assumed you were a dyed-in-the-wool Lutheran.
No, no.
Nice.
Well, yeah, here in Texas, I always say you throw a rock and you're going to hit a Southern Baptist. There's a
Yeah.
lot of Southern Baptists here, Church of
Yeah.
Christ, and other traditions. But yeah, that was how I grew up, and very, very thankful for that foundation.
Nice. Well, that's actually a beautiful segue, your discourse there just on your background with the Bible. So let's go to the main question that we always want to start out with. What is the Bible? I just actually listened to you talk about that on your other podcast, the first episode of the handbook of the Bible.
Oh yeah, sure,
Yeah,
sure,
yeah,
Field
yeah.
Guide to the Bible. Yes,
Field guide,
yes.
that's it. Field guide to the Bible. And you actually
Yeah.
talked about that. So when people ask you, what is this? What is the Bible? How do you talk about that?
Yeah, that is fun that this comes up because just in another podcast that I had 40 minutes in the Old Testament, my co-host and I were talking about that as well, because in our podcast we're in Nehemiah, and at one point it talks about how
Yeah.
Ezra stood up and he read from what's referred to as the Torah. So and that's the first 5 books of the Bible. Now, what I just said is important. First 5 books of the Bible. I thought the Bible was one book. How there are multiple books within there. So this is a basic and understandable misconception that people have, because when we think about the Bible in our modern culture, we think about this book. It's got 2 covers, got all this stuff in between. Some of it's Old Testament, some of it's New Testament. But in reality, if you look at the historical development of the Bible, it's a library. It's a library under 2 covers. So you have a whole lot of books in the Old Testament, and by books, I sometimes mean a pretty hefty amount, such as in Genesis,
Mm-hmm.
but also sometimes what we today would classify as a short story, something like Ruth, something like Jonah. So very, very brief. So some are longer, some are shorter. Some are poetry, some are prose. There are all kinds of different genres there, but each of these parts of the first section of the Bible, the Old Testament, I refer to it as books. And these are written in Hebrew, as well as a little bit of Aramaic in there as well. So that's the first part. The second part, the New Testament, is like the Old Testament. It's a series of books. It's a series of these collected writings. You have 4 Gospels. You have a book called the Acts of the Apostles, which describes those first years of the early church. You have a whole lot of letters from Paul, for instance, and Peter and John. And you have a book where we don't know who the author is, but it's called Hebrews. And then you wrap up with the book probably everybody knows about, and that's Revelation, which is in the genre of the apocalyptic literature. So anyway, that in a nutshell is a description of a very diverse body of literature. So you can't simply open the Bible somewhere and expect it to read just like another section of the Bible. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. It's very different. And anyone who's tried to read through the Bible in 1 year, for instance, realizes, Genesis, it's a pretty captivating story. I mean, it's a great narrative. And the first part of Exodus, very, very captivating narrative. And then you start getting into some maybe less captivating parts for some people. You have all, sacrifices and priesthood and all those sorts of things. So anyway, I would briefly describe it, the Bible, as a library, a collection of diverse books, varying in length by a multitude of different human authors, multitude of different genres, that over time, really over centuries of time, came to be finally then collected together under two covers in the codex or book form, which, from my understanding, was actually an invention of Christianity. The idea of putting, instead of having a scroll, having a book, having
Mm-hmm.
a codex form with two covers, and then all these pages in between for easier reference.
I actually often in my preaching now will refer to the scroll of this or the scroll of that, just as a way of reminding
Yeah.
people about that very same thing. Yeah. So let's bring that to a point. Knowing this idea that the Bible is a library, how is that helpful to someone who's Bible curious, maybe approaching the Bible for the first time? Or let's make the question even tougher. How is it helpful for people who are Bible suspicious? If it
Mm.
is, I
Yes.
don't know.
Yes. Sure. Yeah. Well, there's a lot of Bible suspicious out there, the
Yeah.
folks out there, and I understand that. I mean, there's kind of woven into, especially our modern culture, some what you might think of as understandable challenges to the Scripture,
Mm-hmm.
as well as a whole lot of just I don't know what you want to call it, just kind of trash stories which are untrue, but they're
Yeah.
kind of out there in the culture, which try and say the Bible says this, the Bible says that.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there's some legitimate and serious questions that are raised sometimes. That's great. That's fine. Biblical scholars have never shied away from asking the hard questions and struggling with these sorts of things. Um, and there's other things out there which are just kind of urban myths about the Bible. But as far as knowing all of this, when you approach the Scriptures, how's it helpful? Well, I think this ought to be patently obvious, but I think it needs to be said. We are reading ancient literature, meaning that we should not expect the Bible to read like something that was written in 2023. Um, Ancient literature is going to have different approaches to how it tells the story. Uh, it's going to have a different goal in mind. For
Yeah.
instance, today, if I write a history of World War II, I better have a whole lot of facts that I've documented, footnotes and bibliography and all these sorts of things, because today history is supposed to be, I'm not saying it is, but it's supposed to be objective
Fair.
and non-biased. I'm just telling what happened. Well, when you read biblical history also tells you what happened, but it does so with a very clear and kind of out front intent in mind. This is God's story of God's people. So when it's told in such a way that, I mean, there's nothing hidden here. There's no like hidden agenda.
Right.
This history is sometimes referred to as sacred history, or God's history with his people. So knowing all of that. First of all, it's ancient literature, so it's not gonna read just like literature today. And and depending upon where you're reading, you're going to deal with different genres, and that should be something that we're familiar with. Some of us read poetry, maybe we read uh, a nonfiction. Maybe we like history, so we read a book about World War II, or maybe we're into novels, and so we read novels, or we read the newspaper, or whatever it is. We're dealing with all sorts of genres, and as we all know, you can ask some things of some genres that you cannot ask of other genres.
Good way
So,
to
for
put it.
instance, poetry is more metaphorical, it's
Mm-hmm.
less literal, has this very often hyperbolic, colorful images that are used, which are not found in typical prose. So, when you're reading the Bible, if you go to the Book of Psalms and you hear some very kind of extravagant language about God's actions in history, that's going to sound different than if you were to read, for instance, First Kings or Second Kings, and the history is told differently.
Hmm.
I mean, there's a lot that we could discuss about that, but I think keeping the genre in mind, keeping the fact that it's ancient literature in mind, and keeping the fact that all of these are different human authors, and so they're going to tell the story differently, and some of them are more kind of prosaic, and some are more kind of straightforward in their telling of the story. And some of these books are a mixture. You have prose, you have poetry, kind of woven into the fabric of one book sometimes.
Mm. That's really good. Yeah, I think that's helpful because it helps people to manage their expectations if they have
Yeah.
that awareness coming in, and that helps to mitigate disappointment, I guess, is one way of putting it.
Yes.
Yeah. So here's a
Yeah.
question. Like in my case, I would not, absolutely not call myself a Bible scholar, but I would call myself a Bible student, right?
Mhm.
And that means I have certain tools, but maybe not other tools in terms of approaching the Bible. If someone's coming to the Bible for the first time or early on, and I think today, at least in our context here in New Hampshire, it's not uncommon for people to have hung around the Bible for a long time, but never really investigated it or spent time with it.
Mhm.
Why, with such an ancient book as it is, and why does an ancient book like this really have something for us today, especially one as complex and varied and difficult to tackle as the Bible seems to be?
Yeah. Well, I mean, yes. To get the answer right away, yes, yes. And let me back up and say, I think we have one of the issues we have today. One of the challenges that we have today is that we have there's probably a term for it, but it's basically a modern bias.
Yeah.
And so we tend to think that the more modern, update, present day something is, the more applicable it is to our lives.
Mm,
Uh,
nice.
it's actually it's a very kind of modern actually way of thinking. For most of human history, for most of human history, when people want to know what the good and the wise and the best thing is to do, to believe, they actually do not look at that which is current, but look at that which is ancient. And there's a bit of humility that's baked
Mm,
into that,
mm,
because we we stand on the shoulders of giants, as is often said. Everything that we have today, I mean, for instance, just all of our modern conveniences that we have today,
mm,
uh, built upon sciences and all these sorts of things. How did we get here? Well, we got here because century upon century of scholars and engineers and scientists and thinkers and philosophers have laid this foundation upon which we are now building
yeah.
our thoughts and our actions. So, get back to the Bible itself. Why should we investigate this ancient literature? Well, first of all, I would argue because it is ancient, and because of that antiquity, it is rooted in something which is much bigger than ourselves, much older than ourselves, and that doesn't antiquity doesn't necessarily mean correctness, but antiquity does mean that it stood the test of time.
Mm-hmm.
And anything that stood the test of time should get our attention and make us say, you know what, I want to check this out. And I think another thing that's sort of related to this, it's good. We always say, you get out of your own head. That's good
Hmm.
advice. Get out of your head, sure, yeah. I think we also should get out of our own age, get out of our own culture, and get into something that is very different. And the Israelite culture, for instance, of the Old Testament, very different. The age of the Israelite Old Testament, very different than ours. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes when you step out of that, it gives you a better perspective on where you are, and it might even lead you to question whether some things which you just assumed were true actually are true, or at least lead you down that road.
Mm.
So I think those are at least some things to keep in mind as to why this literature is valuable. And I mean, we could go from there because goodness. For most of even modern history, the last few centuries, it would have been unthinkable for an educated person to be ignorant of the scriptures, because the scriptures form so much of our metaphors and our stories, and it's all woven into Shakespeare. And I mean, all the great thinkers and all the great writers, even if they weren't Christian, even if they weren't theist, they still knew the Bible, because the Bible was that foundational to Western culture. And I'll add one more thing. This is just kind of a side note. It's actually a lot of fun to read. How's that for
Really?
some? It really is. It's fascinating literature. I mean, I get so excited when I study and teach the Old Testament, because goodness, I mean, just kind of leaving aside, if we just take religion out of it, just look at the stories. My goodness, the characters are multifaceted. the plots and the subplots and the tension and the resolution. I mean, this is some of the best just literature that's ever been written.
Yeah.
So I mean, for all those reasons and more, then I think people should be curious about the scriptures and begin to read and study them.
So what I really appreciate about that answer for our purposes is that although I'm quite certain you have a religious viewpoint on it, you didn't really come at it from that point in your answer. And I think that's helpful to a lot of people because it's kind of one of those baby steps things. You got to start here before you're able to accept this as actually a message, inspired for us and preserved for us by God. You have to at least understand what the part of it is. And that's really helpful. Yeah, and I would agree with all of that. Of course, C.S. Lewis wrote some really interesting things about reading old books, right? And
yes,
go back into that. But so given that, it's a deep and complicated and beautiful work, or collection of works. Its antiquity is not a bug; it's actually a feature, right? Of and a good reason why we should go at it. In that case, how should especially a new person who's just kind of checking the thing out and doesn't know what you said, you can't just open it anywhere and expect to, how should someone approach the Bible for the first time or early on?
Yeah, so I'm really not here to promote my own material, but let me
feel free. We'll be talking about that later. Yeah.
It's kind of a lead in to something that I did. Now, the reason I bring it up is because actually that question came to us at 1517.
Yeah.
It just so happened that one of our folks, his daughter was marrying someone who didn't really have any background in the church or in the Bible, and he said, we should produce something for people who are new to the Bible. They don't know who Noah is. They don't know who David is. They don't know who Job or Abraham, anybody who is. They don't know the story, in other words. They don't know the characters. They don't know the plot. So we should produce something which is brief, digestible, clear, not assuming, any kind of biblical or theological knowledge, and let this be a field guide to the Bible for them. And that's actually what we ended up doing. We produced it's a closed podcast, meaning that all the episodes are done. And we called it Field Guide to the Bible, and myself and then two of my friends who are more New Testament guys, we talked, I don't know, there's 20 some episodes that it covers the entire biblical story. So I bring that up because what we were trying to do is to give people the big picture before they jumped into any part of the Bible. And I think that's overall helpful. I mean, usually you don't read like the cliff notes to a novel before you read the novel. But the Bible is different. This is kind of like, okay, you're going to be reading some stuff in this library. So let's give you a big tour of the library so that when you start back over or you want to look at something, you'll know, oh, okay, that's located there. Or that's located there. So yeah, knowing the big story, I think is helpful, the overarching narrative, so that you can fit the individual trees into this forest that you see. So, I think that's at least one good place to begin, kind of get the big picture before you start with these smaller stories.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm actually going to be leaving day after tomorrow to head out to Chicago to train as an instructor for Walk Through the Bible. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they...
I've heard. I'm not too familiar, but I've heard of it, yes.
I'll be conducting 2.5, 3-hour events, live events around the state, at the end of which people who attend will be able to literally recite the story of the Old Testament by memory. Obviously not in depth, but they'll have the whole thing in grasp, and I'm going to be trained to do that for the Bible Society. I'll be doing it, under the aegis of the Bible Society. And it's exactly that kind of thing you're talking about, having that framework. Even my thinking is that even people who have been in the Bible for years, decades, many of them, they hear it in little snippets and sermons and little snippets here and there, devotions, but they don't know where to hang the things or see the context of where these things are in the narrative, in the arc.
Yes.
And so my goal is to help people get excited about reading the Bible by helping them to do that, and form relationships with churches all around the state so that we can work together on this whole thing. So
what a great idea.
I actually didn't know. I knew your 40 minutes thing, and I follow you on Instagram, and I see a lot of the stuff you do there, and I know you've written some books. I did not know about the field guide podcast until you sent it to me, and I was like, oh, looked it up on Spotify. Now I'm following it, right? So I'm going to check it all out. So it's good stuff. Nice. Let's go a little further. I have some very specific questions, and these they're kind of challenging, but I think I'm pretty sure you're up to them. So there's this other Bible scholar who's very popular online. I'm not going to mention him, not because I have anything against him. I just don't want to. He talks about the multivocality of the Bible. And what he's saying is the Bible speaks in many different voices. And it's another way of saying what you were saying about there's lots of different books and lots of different genres by lots of different authors written at lots of different times, right? And each one has their own, I don't know, I wouldn't say axe to grind, but they have their own perspective on the message they're trying to put across. Now, according to this particular scholar, who I have a lot of respect for, he sees the multivocality as means that the meaning of the Bible cannot rest within the text itself, but can only be determined by each person reading out of their community in which they're reading in. Right? And he seems to be saying that divine inspiration, that this is a message from God, isn't really a thing, but that the meaning only emerges from the reading and from the interpretation. And I think he's overstating his case, that the two aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, but I'd be curious to hear how you respond to that very vague description of what he's saying.
Yeah, I think I know the scholar that you're referring to, and I've watched some of.
He's pretty hot. He's pretty heavy out there, yeah, and he's good. I like a lot of his stuff.
Yeah, it's very intelligent, but it's what he's saying though is nothing that's really new. It's nothing that's original with him. I guess I should stress that he's coming out.
He'd probably agree.
Yeah, he's coming out of the work of a lot of the kind of linguistic literature that's been produced over the last, more than the last 100 years. Which locates meaning not in the text, but in a community or an individual or whatever it might be. And we don't have enough time to get into the philosophical weeds here, but a lot of this is based upon some very recent philosophical perspectives on language and things of that nature. So let me first of all start out where I agree with not just him, but those who approach the text in that way. Certainly, there's a multivocality to the scriptures, if by that we mean that there's different voices,
right,
who have different perspectives, who have different aims, who are coming at problems and narratives from different perspectives. And I don't think what I just said is in any way unusual. I mean, you go back to the early church and you read what Chrysostom, for instance, or Augustine, or one of the other early church fathers has to say about the differences between the four Gospels, for instance. And they would be in agreement. Yeah, I mean, they're all presenting different perspectives on the same events, especially John. And this is where the disagreement with some of the modern scholars would begin to be evident. I don't think that the multivocality of the scriptures is evidence of a lack of fundamental theological unity within all of these various biblical books. And one of the reasons I believe that is because, well, first of all, if you just study the text, then you can see that there's a web of interconnections all the way from Genesis to Revelation.
Right.
And this is a building. So you get to the second book of the Bible, and there's already allusions back to the first book of the Bible. You read the third book of the Bible, and there's already allusions back to the second and the first book of the Bible. And then this builds and builds and builds until the farther along you get in the Bible, the more the interpretation of earlier biblical books begins to happen. So that they're weaving into their own writings, earlier writings. And then you get to the New Testament, it's all over the place. I often say that Revelation, the last book of the Bible, that if copyright laws were in place, then John would be in trouble because he was barring every verse is like an allusion to this, an allusion to that, an echo of this, echo of that, a quote of this, quote of that.
Right.
So he's pulling together a lot of Bible there. So you have a lot of human authors who are saying different things. I would argue not conflicting things, but saying a lot of different things for a lot of different reasons. But according to the fundamental Christian confession of the scriptures, you also have a divine author who is working through all of these various human authors to provide a fundamental overarching unity to the story itself. So this is often referred to as inspiration. So the Spirit breathes into these writers, guides these writers. That doesn't mean that they're automatons. It doesn't mean that they're just, authorial robots and the Holy Spirit is doing all the work in their hand and just moving right in the words on there. No, I mean, Paul, for instance, when he's writing to the Corinthians, says, I baptized these people. That's all I baptized. And the next verse, he's like, oh, I forgot. There's some other people I baptized too. So, and anyone who reads them in the original Greek or Hebrew or Aramaic realizes there's different levels of rhetorical competence too. I mean, just like today, some authors are more rhetorical than others. It's the same in the Bible. So it's not as if the author surrendered their personal strengths and weaknesses to the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit was working through these people to write, yes, a diverse text, but I would argue one that is fundamentally united in its intent and its theology and in its perspective from beginning to end.
And that's helpful to people, although it's hard for a novice to discern that.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So
yeah.
I mean, I've been helped by that a lot by the Bible Project and Tim Mackey's. There's the term hyperlinks. Just that works for me to understand. Mm-hmm. And what I've come to understand is that reveals the way the Hebrew mind works differently from the modern American mind. It just worked differently, and so their literature is actually structured differently, and that's on purpose, and it's not an accident. Because I would tend to sometimes look at some of those things before, and I might recognize that there was a hyperlink, but I wouldn't think of it. It's a coincidence.
Yeah, I think the metaphor of the hyperlink is very helpful because the more you begin to, in my own case, the more that I have been immersed in the Old Testament, the more I have the text in my head, the more I begin to pick up these echoes or allusions, these hyperlinks back to earlier stories. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, that's one of the challenges for anyone who begins to read the Bible. Now, when you first start out, you're going to it's confusing. I mean, I will readily admit, when you first start to read the Bible, don't expect to have all these aha moments where all of a sudden you have this great eureka moment, everything's clear. It doesn't work that way. Expect to learn some things. Yeah, there will be some aha moments along there too, but also expect, it's a text like any ancient text that's going to require some thinking and some work and some time, but it pays off. That's why it is the most studied book in human history, because it does pay these spiritual dividends, we might say. It rewards those who put in the labor of reading and studying it and grappling with the questions and asking hard questions and, sometimes coming up with an answer, sometimes coming up with a partial answer, sometimes saying, I don't know. It's the way it is sometimes when you're studying the Word.
Now, when you're talking about a theological through line, right, or a thematic God-focused through line, I know, and I'm not going to say it the way you say it, but I know that part of your shtick, if you will, is that Christ saturates all of the Hebrew Scriptures, right? And that may be a really new idea to people. Well, the Jews wrote that, and then the Christians wrote this. How is it that happens? And I've run into this in a Bible class that I was teaching for some high schoolers at a local Christian school. They were like, "Why should we read the Old Testament?" So how do you respond when people ask you questions like that? What is this idea of finding Jesus all through the Old Testament?
Yeah, it always strikes me as odd. I guess it shouldn't because I've experienced it so much, but it always strikes me as odd when Christians respond in that sort of way. Yeah. Because my assumption has been that people who are church-going people are hearing on a pretty regular basis that when you read Genesis, you are to ask yourself, what does this have to do with the ministry of Jesus? But that's not always the case. In fact, it seems to be not the case more often than it is the case.
Right.
But for Christians anyway, the fundamental confession, and this is based upon the words of Jesus himself, is that beginning already with those books that are called the books of Moses,
Mm-hmm.
which are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the first 5 books, also called the Torah. The beginning with Moses, and then with all the other books, that these, in many and various ways, are speaking of, hinting at, leading us to the denouement, their climax, and that climax is in the ministry of Jesus. So this is the fundamental confession of Jesus about the Old Testament. It was a fundamental confession of the early church about the Old Testament. And it's really been the fundamental confession about the Old Testament, maybe up until recent history. That, okay, so we call them Old Testament, New Testament. First of all, that terminology is not really my favorite terminology. We're kind of stuck with it because It's been with us so long. But I would much prefer to just simply talk about maybe the first part of the Bible and the second part of the Bible, something like that. Because for a Christian, when I'm reading the quote unquote Old Testament, the first part of the Bible, it's not like I'm reading somebody else's mail. It's a pet peeve of mine when someone will say, "Well, that belongs to the Jews." Well, I'm not taking the Tanakh, the first part of the Bible, away from the Jews whatsoever. I'm simply saying that the Christian confession is that this is just as much the Christian Bible as the New Testament is. So it's called kind of a precursor, I suppose, to really answering your question. And it kind of gets to your previous question, too, about inspiration.
Mm-hmm.
So what Christianity confesses about the Old Testament is that this is basically a big story. Now, there's lots of side stories, minor stories that are woven into this that are kind of part of the greater narrative, but it's basically one story. And it begins at creation. That's how Genesis starts out. In the beginning, God creates. He creates the heavens and the earth. And this story progresses through a lot of twists and turns, but basically you have God creating, and then everything falls apart. And so God is going to put in place something which is going to eventually make everything right. And the making everything right is sometimes referred to as the salvation story. And the salvation story, already early in that first book, in Genesis 12, so 12 chapters into the Bible itself, we meet really the guy, he's named Abraham, who's going to take, he and his family, they're going to take this story in the direction that it's going to go really for the rest of the Old Testament. So Abraham is the patriarch of the nation of Israel. He has a son named Isaac, and then Isaac has a son named Jacob. Jacob is also named Israel, and so from him come the 12 tribes. So this salvation story is going somewhere. And when you get to the end of the first part of the Bible, into the Old Testament, it still hasn't got there. The story is incomplete. What's happening is they're waiting on this king, this anointed king who is to come, who's going to set everything right. And that's who we refer to as the Christ or the Messiah, the anointed one of God. So the Old Testament itself, that first part of the Bible, it's a story, a great story, that if you stop there, is unfinished. And then what we would argue is this story is finished then when Matthew starts out his gospel and says, this guy you've been waiting for, this king you've been waiting for, this anointed one, let me introduce you to him. Here's his genealogy, and here's his name, and here's where he lives. He is a descendant of Abraham, a descendant of David. His name is Jesus. He lives in Nazareth, and he is the son of Mary. Then, with that in mind, that Jesus is the one who comes as the fulfillment of that promise, the end of that story. When you have that in mind and you begin to go back and reread Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and all these books, what you begin to realize is that, like any good author, the biblical author, which I would call the Holy Spirit, using these human authors, is already dropping lots of hints, little taps on the reader's shoulder saying, hey, look at this. Hey, watch this. Hey, pay attention to this, because all of these are getting us ready for the end of the story, which comes in Jesus, the Messiah. No, that's just a different way of saying that when you're reading through the Old Testament as a Christian, you already know the end of the story. And the example I always like to give is that movie, The Sixth Sense, where you watch the movie the first time and you don't really know what's going on. You think
Yeah.
you do. You think you do, but you don't. You get to the end of the story and you realize the guy's been dead the whole time. And so there's this great moment of like, oh my, what? How did I not see that? And so you go back and you watch it the second time. You're like, how could I not have seen this all along? It's so obvious. It's kind of like that when the fulfillment comes in Jesus. You go back and you rewatch the Bible movie, as it
Mm.
were, and all over the place, you're like, oh, how did I miss that? There he is. There he's foreshadowed. There he's promised. So for me, that's so much fun because it means that reading the Old Testament is like this discovery, this adventure every single time. And you're uncovering this, you're seeing this from a different perspective, in a different light, and you're seeing that Jesus was part of the story all along. Just wasn't as obvious the first time we read it as it is once we know the end of the story.
As you're describing it, the image that came to my mind is season 1 and season 2. And the thing is, season 2, it's still in production. We've seen the first several episodes, but we're still in production for the rest of the episodes till we get to the finale, right? So, yeah,
Right.
it's kind of
Yeah.
how
The movie's still being made, right? It's
yeah,
being
that's
made right
how,
now. Yeah, even as we speak.
that's the twisted way my mind works. So to go back to the Christ in the Old Testament thing, I'm gonna pretend I'm a skeptic of that, and a believing skeptic. Let's put it this way, because I've heard people criticize that point of view by saying, "Are you kidding me? You mean if I'm reading a verse on how a woman should stay in her house during her menstrual period, that's pointing to Jesus, right? Or somebody's massacring someone else, that's pointing to Jesus? What is that? How do you respond to that?"
Yeah, and we could keep on with example after example.
Yep.
Yeah, in fact, as an exercise in that, just this morning on my Facebook page, I posted a rather lengthy description of a very kind of earthy law that was given to the Israelites. It basically says, hey, when you got to do your business, go outside camp and dig a hole and cover it up when you're done. So I mean, this is in the Bible, right? It's a very practical kind of thing. And anyone
Yeah.
who's gone hiking, and this is actually where I went with the post. Anyone who's gone hiking knows that that's what you do. You dig a cat hole,
Mm-hmm.
and you do your business. You cover it up, and you go on. But that's part of the Bible. So what does that have to do with this big salvation story? And I mean, anyone who's interested can go in and read that on my Facebook post. I won't go into the details here, but let me take your examples. In particular, so yeah, this one that's often brought up. Okay, you got these laws, especially in Leviticus, that tell us about what a woman is to do or not to do, where she's to be, not to
Mm-hmm.
be on her menstrual cycle. So, first of all, why is that even the Bible? And secondly, what in the world does it have to do with anything related to the ministry of Jesus? Well, just as a general principle, when you encounter things such as this, one of the first things you should do after you kind of look at some of the details is step back. Okay, step back from this law, in this case, a ritual kind of law, and ask yourself, so why would that be important enough to record in these sacred books of Israel? I mean, obviously it is. There's something about this that's important. So what would that be? What are kind of the bigger issues that are going on here? And some of the bigger issues are that for the Israelites, there's no such thing as secular. That doesn't exist. There's not
Good
like,
point.
oh, this is a religious part of life and this is a non-religious part of
That's a
life.
good point.
No, I mean, and not just for the Israel, anybody in the ancient world. If you would have like described secular to them, our binary categories of sacred and secular, they'd have looked at you like you were from the moon.
Mm-hmm.
Those don't. Everything is religious. Your family's religious. You're going to war is religious. Your leaders, your politics are religious. Everything is religious because that to be human is to be religious. So as soon as you begin to do a non-human thing, you're non-religious in the ancient world. So to be human is to be religious. So that being said, within their religious daily life, they operated with the understanding that some things were what would render you ritually unclean, ritually impure, and some things rendered you ritually pure. And things like a man having a seminal emission, such as during intercourse, or a woman being on a monthly cycle, these temporarily put them in a state of ritual impurity. Meaning, for instance, that they could not go into the Lord's holy house.
That's what you mean by ritual
Yes.
impurity. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's what I mean by ritual. So,
Yeah.
in other words, this doesn't have there's nothing to do here with what we think of as dirty or kind of gross, nothing like that. So you got to think in different kind of categories. When I talk about ritual impurity, I'm talking about something that has nothing to do with how physically clean or hygienic something is. These are more ritual categories, meaning that they dictate what you can and can't do with regard to the things of God. All right.
Okay.
So a woman, when she's on her menstrual cycle, she can't go into the house of the Lord. She can't worship until her cycle's over. She washes and then she's clean. A man, when he has a seminal emission, has to wait a while, wash, clean. Usually water and wait. Those are the two things that bring a person from out of ritual impurity into ritual purity.
Interesting.
All right, so that's just, I mean, this is kind of a long answer, but it's kind of a complicated subject for us modern people. But so you step back and you're like, oh, so that's why this is important, because there's categories of pure and impure, or clean and unclean, right? Now, you could take those categories of clean and unclean and just kind of expand outward and say, okay, well, what other things in Israel's life made you clean or unclean? And how did this affect your relationship with God? And how did this affect your relationship with one another? And then, kind of with this bigger picture in mind, as well as these individual examples, you go to the ministry of Jesus. And you realize that one of the things that Jesus did is he often would push these boundaries. So, for instance, at one point, he touched a coffin that had a dead man. Well, that should have rendered him ritually impure. But you know what happened is it brought life to the dead man. So rather than Jesus becoming unclean, the guy who's dead comes back to life. Or a woman who had been hemorrhaging, bleeding for 12 years. So in a constant state of ritual impurity, she sneaks up in a crowd behind Jesus because she knows she's not supposed to be there. And she touches the hem of his garment. And immediately power goes from him into her and she's cleansed. He's not made impure. She is cleansed.
Yeah.
So what's happening here is that Jesus he's facing the forces of impurity, often called the forces of death, and he's making it obvious that he is the one who comes to make clean the unclean, to make pure the impure, and to bring them thus into a right relationship with God. And then the kingdom that he establishes also then no longer has these categories of ritual impurity for a woman on a menstrual cycle or a man with a seminal emission or stuff like that. Instead, there's an internalization. So where is the uncleanness today? Well, it's not in my, the outward part of it. It's my heart. It's the murder, the adultery, the greed, the lust, all these kinds of things that are within me. That's what makes me unclean. And so that means that the cleansing that Jesus does is not an outward, but it's an inward. He cleanses our heart from all of these moral impurities in order to make us clean before the eyes of God. Now, that's a long answer to a specific example, but I think that's what you got to do.
Yeah.
You got to look closely. Okay, what's this talking about? Step back. Okay, what are the bigger issues? What's this mean? What are some of the examples of that? Kind of what's this worldview in general? And then work your way to the New Testament and say, okay, well, how did Christ interact with that and perhaps even turn it upside down in his ministry?
Yeah. Again, that reminds me of something Tim Mackey talks about a lot. This is Jewish meditation literature, right? So you're just saying in so many words that if it doesn't make sense, don't assume that it's stupid.
Yes.
But take some time, which is what a lot of moderns, I think, tend to do, right? Oh, this doesn't make any sense. Yeah. This is stupid. That instead, as you say, step back and ask, what is going on here that I don't understand? And of course, there's lots of resources out there like yours, your 40 minutes and your field guide and your books, and 1517 has a ton of stuff, just to help people grapple with some of those issues and try and understand that. And there's no time that had more, portals or gateways to enter into these kinds of ideas in the scripture. Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Listen, I could just chat with you for hours, and you've been very gracious, and your answers have been fantastic. And I hope our listeners have found this helpful. As you can kind of tell, I'm kind of putting myself in the position of the kind of questions I think some of our listeners would be asking. You've done really well. So here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to go ahead right now and pitch your own stuff. Tell us where people can get in touch with you, what books you've got out there that you want them to buy, what other stuff you have that's going to help them get where they need to go.
Yeah, so let me begin with maybe what the listeners are most interested in, that the Bible itself. So I've already mentioned the field guide to the Bible, and if you're wanting to kind of have a step-by-step, verse-by-verse, chapter-by-chapter, book-by-book walk, very slow, very, very in-depth walk through the scriptures, then check out my podcast, 40 Minutes in the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. We've been at it for 7 or 8 years, my co-host and I, and we've only covered Genesis to Nehemiah, which is, if you're not familiar with the Bible, we're maybe halfway.
Halfway through the Hebrew scriptures.
Yes.
Yeah.
We got ways to go.
Yeah.
He and another friend also have a complement to that called 30 Minutes in the New Testament. And you can find all these podcasts and many more at 1517.org.
Anywhere podcasts are found, right? Yeah.
Anywhere podcasts are found, exactly. I've written several books. I write about a book a year. For those who might want to know a little bit more about my backstory, just as kind of a teaser here, how would a Hebrew professor at one point in his life become a truck driver? And then later become a scholar in residence. If that intrigues you, then you can check out my book, Night Driving, Notes from a Prodigal Soul. If anyone is interested in my background, then that will tell them kind of why I approach things the way I do. And then my most recent book is about Jacob. It's called Limping with God, Jacob in the Old Testament Guide to Messy Discipleship, where I take Jacob's life and just walk through that and apply lessons from that to our lives. So I have videos out. I'm on all the socials. So whatever you're on, I do short TikTok videos. I do Instagram posts. I do a Facebook post. I got a YouTube channel. So just search me. It'll pop up there. And whatever you're kind of into, whether you like the shorter stuff or the longer videos, I try and kind of fill that gap with daily material.
You do have quite a variety. Absolutely. Yeah. Very good. As one beard brother to another, let me just say thank you very much. It's been great. And is there any last parting words you want to throw out there?
No, just that I hope that our discussion has been helpful. And I really encourage people who may be curious about the Bible to check it out and to enjoy what these books have to say to us. Because I think even if you're hesitant at first, you're going to realize that it has a captivating quality to it. It kind of lures you in. And by the time that you're in it, you realize that this is some rich literature that has a lot to teach us about ourselves and about God and about one another as well.
That's great, Chad. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, that is our interview with Chad Bird. Do you see what I mean? Chad just cuts through it and shows you what's what. Just remember, if you are kind of new to the Bible, the fact that it's ancient and strange is actually the reason we should read it. Don't give in to your modern bias, or what C.S. Lewis calls our chronological snobbery. And then when you're reading the Bible and you run into something that is weird, just step back a minute and ask you what's going on, because there may be, actually I would say there absolutely is, a good reason why it's there. And even if it isn't immediately apparent to you or to me. And I would say one place you can definitely find some really good explanations of those kind of things are Chad's podcasts and Chad's books. And listen, even if you're not Lutheran, be sure to go to 1517.com and learn more about Chad and all the resources that are available from 1517.com. They're really smart, they love Jesus, and they know how to deliver the goods for sure. So whether you're a Baptist or a Catholic or a Methodist or none of the above, there's good stuff in there for you, I guarantee it. Check out Chad's books, Night Driver and Limping with God, and his podcasts, 40 Minutes in the Old Testament and A Field Guide to the Bible. Look him up on whatever social media platform you prefer. He's pretty all over. So, having said all that, congratulations to you. You have managed once again to listen to another entire episode of Hello Bible, and sincerely, thank you for that. If you think that we merit it, please go ahead and leave us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast app you use to feed your personal podcast habit. If you have not already done so, go ahead and follow and subscribe so you can keep up with new episodes when they come out. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to smash both the like and the subscribe buttons because we can't just click on anything anymore. We have to smash them. And be sure to share this episode with your friends, a bunch of people you don't even know, and especially share it with your enemies. You can find us, the New Hampshire Bible Society, on Facebook, Instagram, and our website at BibleNH.org, BibleNH.org. The New Hampshire Bible Society is a non-profit organization that partners with churches all over New Hampshire to help them engage with the Bible, to cultivate and encourage discipleship of Jesus Christ. And because New Hampshire, well, we are the least religious state in the entire nation, we're a mission field. And we have supporters all over the place. If you would like to support gospel ministry in New Hampshire, no matter where you are, through the Bible Society, go to BibleNH.org/support. Hey, grace and peace to you. Great hanging out with you. Let's do this again soon.